All right. Welcome to Understanding Anger 2.0, session 12. This is an ongoing series that we may do for years and years and years that has to do with taking texts and ideas and thinkers from ancient to medieval, maybe even early modern, later on down the line periods, and mining them and their works for what they have to tell us about anger as an emotion. So, understanding anger 2.0, because originally there was a series called Understanding Anger that we did back, about 10 years ago, before we left Kingston, New York, came back here to Milwaukee. I've been teaching classes occasionally for Marquette University, like semester long courses on the emotion of anger. And so people were like, well, maybe you could start that series again. And that is what this is. So we've already had 11 previous sessions looking at different authors in antiquity, some of them philosophical, like Plato, Aristotle, the Epicureans, Cicero, some of them literary, like Homer, Hesiod, the Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, all those sorts of people. And today, for the first time, we are going to begin looking at and delving into a work that is specifically about the emotion of anger. So some of you already know who I'm talking about. Seneca, he's got an entire treatise called On Anger, which is divided up into 3 books. And so for each of the sessions, 12, 13, and 14, we are going to look at the insights that he has in these books. It doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with every single thing that he's saying about this, but he has a lot of very interesting ideas and useful insights and practices. Now, Seneca is one of the late Stoic authors. When it comes to the Stoics, the majority of the literature that we have is from what we call the late Stoa, the Roman Stoa. So we have Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and then some other people as well, like Musonius Rufus and Heracles, Arius Didymus. In the case of Seneca, he is the Stoic whose works we have the most of, including this entire work on anger. And so we're looking at the emotion of anger, ethical issues that are involved, how anger works, practices for dealing with it. We'll see a lot of critical engagement between Seneca and other people, particularly Aristotelians, who he thinks have anger more or less wrong. So today we're going to be just presenting some of the key ideas from book 1, which are contributions that Seneca is making to our understanding of this emotion of anger. And then, we'll look at book 2 and book 3 in the next couple months. And, feel free to put stuff in the chat if you've got questions or comments. We'll take some pauses here and there for Q&A, either catching up on stuff that's already in the chat or, soliciting questions and comments, because there's a lot of ground to cover here. And there's a few things to say before we jump into the text itself, just about Seneca and Stoicism in general. So the Stoics have a systematic and complex account of the human emotions. And it's wrong to think that the Stoics say, oh, emotions are always bad, stuff them down, don't be emotional. That's not actually Stoicism. That's a caricature of Stoicism that is kind of popular today, but isn't really in line with classic Stoic texts and teachings. Stoics thought there were bad emotions. Anger is one of them. And then there are good emotional states, the eupathei in Greek, and we should try to cultivate those. So we shouldn't be unloving or not joyful, or it's even okay to be fearful sometimes if you're being rationally cautious about matters. But the Stoics don't see any positive role to anger. And Seneca is going to give us a whole bunch of reasonings why, many of which are being made in opposition to other philosophical schools. I've mentioned the Aristotelians. He also tends to think the Platonists are off base when it comes to anger. The Epicureans saw some good role for what they called natural anger as opposed to empty anger. Seneca and the Stoics are going to go even further and say there's no good anger. Um, Seneca is somebody who has studied and practiced Stoicism, and he's probably the most, not eclectic, but let's say willing to take on ideas from other schools and thinkers. He's the most willing of the Stoics that we have to do that. And he's also, we should point out, as many authors are, including Cicero, Augustus is bringing up Cicero, um, prone to sometimes engaging in some rhetorical constructions that, if we consider, very, very literally, are probably false. They go too far in what they claim or argue. But in those cases, we can say, okay, what is he actually getting at? How true is what he's putting forward? And I think that's the sort of attitude that we want to adopt towards those sorts of constructions. So, jumping in, the first topic that he begins with is talking about why anger, of all of the passions, of all of the vices, is the worst, right? So it's an interesting way to begin his point. He says that it's, of all the passions, hideous titrum and wild rabidum, the word that we get rabies from. So think about people who are rabid with their rage. And he says that we can contrast anger against the other emotions in a variety of ways. So the other emotions have some bit of peace or quiet to them. Anger, on the other hand, is all about action and the impulse caused by pain, dolor in Latin. It has a desire for fighting. It's careless for itself as long as it can attack. And it's so greedy for revenge that even when it damages the one who it's aimed at, it also damages the one who seeks it. So anger is a bad thing, or a worse thing, in comparison to all of these other these things. And then he also brings up this famous line: anger is a short or brief madness. So why would he say that? He gives us some reasons for this. He says that it completely lacks self-control. And think about what it's like when you're angry, the experience of losing control in anger. It is regardless of what in Latin is decorum, we might say proper social behavior. It is forgetful of kinship. It is forgetful of the ties that we human beings have to each other based on, family or even friendship. It's engrossed in whatever it begins to do. Once you get angry and you start doing things, if other people contradict you, you get mad about that. It's deaf to reason and to advice. It gets excited by trifling causes. People can get angry over all sorts of silly things, right? It's awkward at perceiving what is true and just. And then he says it's very much like a falling rock which breaks itself to pieces upon the very thing it crushes. So that's a long list of bad things about anger, right? And then he talks about how anger affects our bodies. So again, this goes back to why anger is in some respect worse. When you get angry, it affects your body in a whole bunch of different ways. For example, myself, I found this out when I was teaching at Indiana State Prison, and I was still kind of a hothead. My ears turn red. And I also get from adrenaline, I get the shakes because anger is my body preparing itself for fighting, right? Anger may affect you in other ways. It shows in our faces, it shows in the tension of our body. So Seneca says that other vices can be concealed, but in both human beings and animals, anger reveals itself in the body. And it's also worse in its effects and what it leads to. What are these? Slaughterings and poisonings, accusations and counter accusations, sacking cities, ruin of whole peoples, people sold into slavery by auction, burning things down. This is kind of a common thing in ancient times. You're mad, you go light something on fire, massacres, all these sorts of things are the effects of dramatic effects of anger. And so at this point, Seneca says, okay, what is anger? So he will call it a desire to inflict punishment against those who are perceived to have done injury. Now, if you remember back to when we looked at Aristotle's definition of anger, this is similar. It covers a good bit of the same ground. There's a desire, it's an orientation to impose something bad on somebody else, punishment in this case. Retribution is another way of thinking about it. Not against anybody whatsoever, but against those who are perceived to have done something wrong. And he considers a couple objections to this. Some people say, well, wait a second. We get angry with people who haven't yet done anything wrong to us, but they threaten it, or we think that they will hurt us. And Seneca says, oh, buddy, you're just projecting already onto them that they're going to do it. They already hurt us in intention, and you're just getting angry because you perceive that. Another objection is, well, wait a second. Weak people can't punish strong people, but they do get angry with them. So, they had slavery back in ancient times. You're a lowly house slave. The master comes by and, you're doing your work, and the master pours wine over your head and says, look at you, jackass, or something like that. You can't punish the master, but you still get angry. And Seneca says, it doesn't matter whether you actually can inflict the punishment. It's the desire to inflict the punishment, not the power to do so. We desire all sorts of things that are actually impossible for us. And then he brings up Aristotle. Aristotle, one of the definition that he has in the topics is anger is a desire to make the other suffer in return, or a desire to repay suffering. Seneca brings that up, and he says, a similar definition. It's not the fuller rhetoric definition, which we talked about in a previous session, which you can find in Rhetoric Book 2. But it's along the same lines. And we do also have a few other definitions of anger that are contained in a section of not Seneca as such, but Lactantius, a later author, who provides us with some quotes from Seneca's on anger that we often will put at the start of it. These are lost from the manuscripts that we have. So Posidonius, who was another Stoic before Seneca, said anger could be a desire to punish one by whom you think you've been unjustly injured. Now notice the unjustly being added there. Some others have defined it as anger is an impulse of the mind to injure the person who either has injured you or sought to injure you. So we got a bunch of different definitions, and you notice they all have these similar points to them. Anger is a desire, and it moves you towards hurting somebody else, but hurting them not just to hurt them. It's not, sadism or cruelty. It is because you think that you're somehow making things right. You're rectifying matters by imposing this on them. You're making them have to deal with what you dealt with. And so we could ask at this point, okay, now we know what anger is. What isn't anger. And Seneca is going to say some very interesting things about that as well. So there's things that we sometimes call anger, but they're not really anger. So he brings up people getting angry at the gladiatorial games. These are games that people are fighting, sometimes to the death. Why do we get angry with the gladiators for not dying cheerfully? I mean, if we were thrown into the ring, would we be like, oh, this is really great? I'm so happy to serve. It's kind of stupid to think that. So, why do people get angry about that? They feel themselves being wronged by the gladiators. They judge, judicat, that they have been scorned, contemni in Latin. They've been treated as lesser than they should be. I'm here to watch, you're here to fight and die. If you're not happy about fighting and dying, well, then, we're going to get angry. And Seneca says they turn from spectators into adversaries. But he says this isn't really anger as such. This is something like anger, quasi ira in Latin. And he brings up examples, young people who fall on the ground and then they hit the ground, right? The ground is hurting them. You might even think about the meme with the guy who's riding along and he puts the stick through the spokes of his wheels and his bicycle and falls over, and then he curses something else because he's supposedly angry. And Seneca says these people don't know why they're angry. They're angry without any sort of reason or injury. And he also says an unreal or falsa pain is healed by an unreal revenge. So that looks like anger, but it's not really anger. He also talks about animals, wild beasts, who get angry without being excited by injury and without the idea of punishing others or, satisfying their demands by making them feel pain. And he says, even though they do these things, that's not what they're aiming at doing. And what beasts are motivated by, so animals that are not human, isn't really anger. And why not? So here we're getting to Seneca using the word in a somewhat different way than we might, right? He says that anger, it's the foe of reason. It's the enemy of reason, but it doesn't arise in any place where reason can't dwell, right? And so wild beasts, they have impulses. They are beings that have intentions, feelings of sorts. They can feel fury or cruelty or combativeness, but they don't have, according to Seneca, they don't really have human emotions. They just have certain impulses which resemble them. So they don't actually feel, and he gives you a bunch of different examples, they don't actually feel fear or anxieties or grief or anger like we do. They feel some semblances, quidam similia, things that are kind of like those. And they quickly drop them and adopt the opposite of it, whereas human beings will feel these for quite a bit. And this is a topic he doesn't fully explore here, but he will more in books 2 and 3. So we'll talk more about these matters in future sessions. The other thing that we want to distinguish anger from, which it's connected with, is what we can translate as irascibility. So anger is ira, and then irascibility is this more global tendency, iracundia, the tendency to get irate, you could say. So he says that the difference between anger and irascibility is the same as that between a drunken person and a drunk, somebody who characteristically gets drunk. So which is worse, anger or irascibility? Irascibility is worse. It's like a vice that's rooted in your character. And he says, it's possible for an angry person not to be irascible. And, there's times when an irascible person might not be angry. And he brings up all these different varieties of anger that the Greeks distinguished by different names. Now, who are the Greeks in this case? People like Aristotle, other authors who discuss anger as well. And he says we don't actually have distinct words for them in our language. And then, of course, he uses the distinct Latin words. So he's kind of a little bit inconsistent there. What do we talk about people being like? Bitter, harsh, peevish, frantic, clamorous, surly, fierce. And he says each of these is a different kind of irascibility. It's a different way in which you're characteristically projecting anger out into the world and in your relations with other people. He even talks about a refined form of irascibility, sulkiness, being morose in Latin. And he says that there's some kinds of anger that are, very lasting, like this sulkiness. So these are you better understood as like dispositions in relation to this emotion of anger. So that's already a little bit of discussion there. Let me actually very quickly address the comments and questions. So Augustus says, I'm almost done with your series on Cicero, and that anger can become a strong drink poured by the bottle of emotion. I mean, that's a good metaphor, but it's a little bit confusing because anger is an emotion, right? So it's poured by itself, you could say. Thanks to Augustus, a donation to the Stoa. That's very nice of you. Campbell says, if you could relate these authors in schools, you're discussing to Oscar Wilde's The Just Rancor, the criminal classes, which struck me as touchingly and powerfully emphatic. Well, I mean, Oscar Wilde is not endorsing every bit of anger that criminal classes necessarily feel. Some of them may be rageaholics, and Cicero would, or not Cicero, well, actually Cicero would, because Cicero also holds with the Stoics. Seneca would say, there is no just rancor. It's never going to be just. Whereas, the Aristotelians, Platonists, Epicureans, they can actually say, well, you got to be really careful with anger. A lot of people get it wrong, but it could actually be just and serve justice. So that's a great segue into the big discussion. We've got some preliminaries out of the way. A lot of what's going on in book one is actually talking about whether we need anger, whether anger serves any useful purposes or not. And now Nabila says, anger clouds clear judgments, if possible, restrain it. Yeah, we're gonna see how that happens in a moment. So Seneca says some people seem to think that anger is either useful or necessary or honorable. And, it seems like the correction of others is necessary sometimes. And doesn't this require you to get angry? So, you are going to keep your kids from being bad people. You got to get angry with them and punish them. And, he's going to say, no, good correction doesn't injure. It actually heals under the guise of injury. And correction can go a long way. Seneca will actually talk about sometimes you actually do need to kill people. But even in these extreme cases, you're not doing it because you're angry. You're doing it because it's the best thing to do, even for that person, the criminal. It's to their own advantage. And we'll look at that argument a little bit later on. A lot of people would say anger is useful for accomplishing what it is that we need to do. So anger rouses our spirit, excites it. Courage does nothing great without it. Where is this coming from? I mean, Plato talks like that in the Republic, doesn't he? With the middle part of the soul, the thumos, the part that gets angry. We need that to help enforce reasons, rule upon the appetites. Another possibility, maybe it's good to control anger, but don't get rid of it altogether. We want to moderate it. We want to keep it within useful bounds. That's arguably a Platonic and Aristotelian point of view. And Seneca has a response to that. He says, It's not easy. It's easier not to admit or to get rid of dangerous passions than to try to moderate them and keep them in order. And he says reason is only strong when it's separated from the passions. If you mix it in with them, reason is actually working for the passions, not controlling them. The passions run the show. And, who else is saying things sort of like that? In a more extreme way, David Hume down the line, reason is can only be the slave of the passions, which, by the way, is not really his point of view. But if Seneca is saying, if you don't want reason to be the slave of the passions, you've got to get rid of those passions. And he's got this metaphor sort of like stepping off of a cliff, right? It's up to you whether you step off the cliff, but once you've done it, it's not like the cartoons where you can like step off and like look around. You're going all the way down, right? So once you've given in to anger or love or any other passion, the mind is dragged along, Seneca says. So that doesn't really work as an argument. It's useful for accomplishing what we need to do. And Seneca goes on further and he says, by the way, you don't want to try to use one passion to battle another passion. So if you don't want people to be angry, make them scared, because being irrationally scared, that's not good either. Or use anger against laziness or greed against timidity. He says the mind and virtue are in trouble if they cannot be brave without anger, or diligent without greed, or quiet without fear. And a passion is only useful if it's useful by nature, but if it's disobedient to reason, then all we get by moderating it is that there's less of it and it does a little less harm, but it's still a bad thing, right? It's sort of like saying, I don't take a fatal dose of poison. I just take like half of a dose, and that's great for me. No, it's still poison. It's still bad for you, is what Seneca is saying. And then, he's going to deal with another common objection. We need anger so that we can fight against our enemies. And Seneca says, is that really true? We don't want our attacks on enemies to be disorderly. We want them regulated and under control. And so he gives examples of barbarians. Rome had a disciplined military. They trained all the time. They would fight. They didn't have to be angry to fight. The barbarians come out and they're, wild and crazy and, got rage in their eyes and they attack. But they're not very effective compared to Roman soldiers because they give in to anger. Gladiators too. If they're fighting and they give in to anger, they make stupid moves and they'll lose. And he even goes on to talk about hunters. Now, hunting now for a lot of people is, quite frankly, pretty easy. You get yourself a gun and you shoot an animal at a distance and all that. If you got to actually hunt wild boar and you got to do it with spears, that's a little bit trickier, right? And he says, do the hunters get angry with the beasts that they hunt? No, they'd be stupid. Instead, they are calm and they hunt the beast, and the beast might, get wild with them, but they're not going to do that. So he says anger is prone to rashness and doesn't guard itself against danger. So the most trustworthy virtue is one that controls itself and brings itself slowly and deliberately to the front, not rushing out into battle. And then he considers another possible argument that people will bring up. Well, wait a second. We need anger to do the right thing. We need anger to promote justice. And he says he's going to use a really extreme case. Wouldn't a good person be angry if he sees his father murdered or his mother being raped? Wouldn't that get you angry? And Seneca says, no, because you don't have to get angry to avenge your father or protect your mother. There's other things you can rely upon, like piety, filial piety, a feeling of responsibility. pietas. This is enough even without anger. And a good person can do their duty without disturbance or fear. They can perform the duties of a good person so as to do nothing unworthy of them. And he says, my father's going to be murdered. I'll defend him. He's been slain. I'll avenge him. Not because I'm pained, not because I'm feeling that pain, which leads to a desire for revenge, but because it is my duty. It's the right thing to do. So he says to feel anger on behalf of your friends or your family doesn't actually show a loving, but instead a weak mind. The better way of behaving is to be the defender of your parents, children, friends, countrymen, because it's the right thing to do, acting of your own free will, forming a deliberate judgment, looking forward to the future. Notice all these components rather than in an impulsive, frenzied fashion. That's not actually going to serve protection or justice. And he says, no passion is more eager for revenge than anger. For that very reason, it's not likely to obtain it. Why? Because it's hasty. It wants to get in there. It's frantic. It hinders itself in the attainment of its own object. And it's not useful either in peace or in wartime. So, this is a pretty interesting argument. And he's going to bring up some other objections people might make, like saying that, maybe you're right. Maybe anger isn't the right thing to do, but, it could be useful for dealing with other bad things. And he says, yeah, fevers are good for certain kinds of ill health, but isn't it better to be free from any sort of disease? Why would you use one disease to combat another? And he says, anger, like poison or falling down or being shipwrecked, it might have done some good. Like, so I'll give you an example of a time that I got angry at somebody. It was the wrong thing for me to do, but it actually had a good effect. Early in my prison teaching, I was kind of a hothead, and there was a guy named Jarvis, and he was in one of my first classes, and he wasn't reading the text, and he was like, talking in class and giving his opinion, and it was poorly informed. And I said, why are you wasting our time with this? And he says, well, it's my opinion. I have a right to express it. And I got mad and I said something along the lines of, nobody here cares what your opinion is. It doesn't have any value whatsoever unless it's actually based in something real, like what we're studying. And then he got mad. He shut up, and we didn't talk then. And he finished my class, and I didn't see him for like another couple of years. And then one day he came up to me and he said, hey, I got to thank you. And I was like, thank me for what? And he said, nobody had ever told me that my opinion didn't have value in itself. And it made me go back to the cell block and think about it. And I was real mad at you. And I talked to some of the older guys, and they helped explain what you were getting at with that. And it helped turn my life around. And I was like, well, that's really great. But that sure as hell wasn't what I was trying to do. I was just trying to shut you down and shut you up. I was mad. I was kind of out of line when I was doing that. So it had a good effect, but that was just lucky, right? It could have had all sorts of bad effects as well. And so that's Seneca's point, is just because, sometimes poison is proved good for the health, it's still poison. You don't want to use that. So then he talks about, anger being useful because it readies people for fighting. And he says, if you're going to follow that line of reasoning, then drunkenness is a good thing because it makes people insolent and daring. And a lot of people, use their weapons better when they're drunk. According to that reasoning, you would call frenzy and madness essential to strength because madness makes people stronger. And he says, listen, if you want to be brave, nobody actually becomes brave through anger, except the person who without anger would not have been brave at all, wouldn't have acted in a brave way. anger doesn't assist courage. Anger replaces courage. So you can either be angry or you can be courageous, but you can't actually be both. So that's well worth thinking about. Now he brings up Aristotelians again, and he actually names off Theophrastus and Aristotle. And Theophrastus was Aristotle's good friend and successor, right? So Theophrastus says it's impossible for a good person not to be angry with bad people. And Seneca says, well, that's clearly wrong, because what this means is that the better you are, the more irascible you're going to be. And, the more you know about people, the more you can find to be angry with. So that to say that like the wise person or the good person is going to be angry all the time, that seems kind of weird. And he also says, if you follow this line of reasoning, you're going to get mad at yourself because you make mistakes too. If you hate the erring, the mistaken, you're going to hate yourself as well. Aristotle, and we don't actually have this in his work, so we're not sure where this is coming from. Seneca says that Aristotle tells us certain passions, if one makes a proper use of them, act as weapons or arms. And Seneca is going to say, okay, that could work if, like weapons, you could pick them up or lay them aside at your own decision. But what happens with anger? It fights of its own accord. Once you actually get angry, anger is not like a weapon that waits for you to pick it up. Anger is using you to do things, and it possesses a person instead of being possessed by them. So this line of reasoning doesn't really work. And he says, listen, if you want weapons, nature has already given us reason. Reason is strong, imperishable, obedient to our will, not being capable of being turned against its master. And so it's kind of stupid or foolish for reason to beg anger for protection. Reason should be running the show. When reason has decided a certain thing should be done, it perseveres in doing it, right? Because reason is the best thing in us. Anger is also unreliable as a weapon. It's often overcome by pity or compassion. It makes a violent beginning. It's really good for starting out. It doesn't have any sort of staying power. It gets fatigued too soon. So if what you want is weapons, use the one or the tool, reason, which we have. Don't rely on this passion, which can just get us into all sorts of trouble. So there's a lot of questions and comments. Let me turn to those for a bit, and then we'll talk about some more contrasts between anger and reason. So Nabila asks if I can make a video on Plato's allegory of the cave. I already did that a long time ago. All you got to do is like search within the channel and find that stuff. Campbell says an important contribution from Solomon and Proverbs: do not consort with people given to anger, for you may learn their ways and be ensnared by them. Yeah, this is a common sentiment. Seneca is going to say stuff like that. Epictetus is going to say stuff like that. Aristotle and Plato are both very attuned to how companionship tends to produce habits within us. The other thing is too, you see this a lot in the wisdom literature, in Hebrew scriptures. If you hang around with angry people, not only are they going to rub off on you, you're probably going to get in fights with them too, right? Sooner or later, right? So it's not a good idea to be hanging out with too many angry people. Augustus says powerful point that he made on judging aside from anger. Yeah, and then fighting a passion with another passion would probably lead to hedonism rather than stoicism. Not necessarily hedonism. It leads, in Seneca's view, to giving into these passions too much, right? So it doesn't have to lead to a desire for pleasure. It could lead to all sorts of other things as well. Um, let's see. Augustus says the cynic might be mad all of the time. It's interesting because you notice that the cynics are not mad all of the time. Why not? Because they don't get mad over other people being screw ups, in part because the ancient cynics were not just there to, like, mess with people or live a simple life. They actually viewed themselves as being the heralds or representatives of God on earth to show a better example. And they wanted to live a life as free from trouble as possible. So if you're getting mad, if you're Diogenes or you're Antisthenes or Crates, who, by the way, Crates, very important cynic who taught Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, known for his philanthropia, his love of humanity, right? If you're one of these people and you see everybody else around you screwing up and you would like them to live better lives, getting angry isn't going to help you do that. You could be Diogenes going around with the lantern, being kind of a smart ass, saying, I'm looking for an honest person. You don't have to do that in anger, though, right? Now, Nabila brings up another interesting point that isn't discussed so much here by Seneca, but is part of our experience, I think. When anger recedes, all is left is shame. I mean, sometimes with some people. When we see how we behaved and what foolishness anger led us into doing, saying, committing to, all of those sorts of things, yeah, very often we feel it could be shame or embarrassment, eidos in Greek. It could be a sense of regret or, what the Greeks called metanoia, repentance, but it's going to be a bitter kind of emotion about how badly we behaved. So now the opposite are the people who stay angry, and they're angry even about that other people don't recognize that their anger is righteous. And so they're just stuck in the anger, right? Augustus asks, why couldn't Seneca diagnose Nero? Because he's not a doctor. That doctors diagnose. I mean, Seneca did know that Nero was a bad guy. He tried to retire from Nero's service twice, was turned down both times. He did as much as he could to insulate himself from Nero, who originally had great promise and then became worse and worse and worse, but Nero wouldn't allow it. And then there was this Pisonian conspiracy against Nero, and Seneca is ordered by Nero to kill himself. And if he hadn't had done that, Nero would have killed his entire family, most likely. So, Seneca isn't to be blamed for not, viewing the later Nero as a bad guy. He did view him as a bad and dangerous guy, and he tried to get the hell away from him, but he wasn't able to because Nero was the emperor, right? So it's sort of like when people are, they get into these side notes that really don't have much to do with the actual philosophy. They'll be like, why did Marcus Aurelius allow his son to take the throne? Well, if he didn't, things would have turned out even worse. Civil War. Donald Robertson has written a lot about this sort of stuff. But none of that is relevant to the text or whether it's, correct or incorrect. You don't have to be a perfect representative of what you're putting forward in order to be right about what you're putting forward. Aristotle was criticized for wearing rings and fancy clothes. Does that mean that his philosophy is no good? No. I mean, it's got nothing to do with it, right? If, we found out that he was so fashion conscious that he didn't get around to doing any work, okay, that might have something to do with it then. All right, so coming back to what's going on in this text, Seneca is going to make some more contrasts between anger and reason. And so now this is very interesting. It shows us certain important factors. Reason gives each side time to plead its case and will demand adjournment. So it'll actually like say, okay, I got to step back and think about this a while. Why? Because it wants to have enough time to discover the truth. Anger doesn't do that. Anger is fast. Anger's in a hurry. It wants to get things done right away. It wants to impose it already knows enough about the situation. It wants to impose that revenge on the other person. Reason also wants to give a just decision. Anger wants its decision to be thought just. This is why we can get angry at other people who, when we're angry, don't share our point of view. We're like, that son of a bitch, I'm going to get him. And they're like, whoa, what's going on, buddy? And you're like, well, he did this and this and this to me, and that's wrong. And they're like, well, first of all, I don't know if he did those things, but let's say he did, maybe you had it coming. If you're angry at the police person for giving you a parking ticket, when you parked in front of a meter and let the meter run out, you're in the wrong, right? But anger will be like, they still shouldn't have given me the ticket. Whereas reason would be like, well, actually, I did deserve the ticket. So that's another important thing. Reason, he says, looks no further than the matter at hand. It sticks to what's relevant. And this is an experience that I think all of us have had. Anger is excited, he says, by empty matters hovering on the outskirts of the case. So anger will bring in all sorts of irrelevant stuff. If you've ever had a fight with your significant other and you or they brought up all sorts of irrelevant things that have nothing to do with what you're arguing about, well, this is exactly what Seneca is pointing out here, isn't it? So there's a lot of easy to relate to examples here. He also says that anger loves and maintains error, even when the truth is staring it in the face. It hates to be proven wrong and thinks it more honorable to persevere in a mistaken line of conduct than to retract it. So again, I think all of us have experienced this. We got angry over something. We weren't right to get angry. We stick to that story, even when other people point out that, whoa, this isn't this way, and this isn't this way. And your anger is actually unjustified. We're like, no, it is right. I'm angry for good reasons, right? And he says that irascibility is angry with the truth itself if it comes to light against its will. So anger is not going to get us, it's not based in truth. It's not going to get us at the truth. Reason will. And so this is a very interesting set of contrasts there that he's giving. He also talks about punishment. And he says that, when you're going to punish somebody, which sometimes you have to do, you want to free yourself from anger, because then you'll assign to people the penalty that they actually deserve. And sometimes this might lead to a certain kind of clemency, right? So if we detect that somebody has done a crime, but their penitence, their regret gives us some good hope for the future, we might not punish them, or we might punish them less. Or if we perceive that the badness of a person is not deeply rooted in their mind, but it's, only, as we say, skin deep, we might let them off as well, or we might give them less of a punishment. Sometimes we'll give mercy in cases where punishing isn't actually going to help anybody. It's not going to help the receiver or the giver. Sometimes we'll punish great crimes more leniently than lesser ones if we find mitigating circumstances, like it's the result of momentary impulse, not cruelty. It's not an intentional, deliberate act. And this is reflected in our legal system, right? We sometimes have the discretion to give people lesser sentences. The same crime or fault committed by two different people might not be visited with the same penalty if one was guilty of it through carelessness and the other had a premeditated intention of doing wrong, right? So we distinguish those sorts of things. And, when we're dealing with crime, Seneca says, and now he's not originating this is an idea going all the way back to Socrates. We should remember that the point of punishment is future oriented. It's meant to make bad people better, or if they're so bad that, we can't deal with them, to get them out of the way so that other people don't have to deal with them. But it's not about just hurting people to settle a balance. That's what anger does. So anger makes us look backwards and say, I got to punish this bastard for doing wrong to me or doing wrong to other people. A just punishment, one driven by reason, is going to say, what is the good that's going to be accomplished, not just now, but for the future, right? So Seneca says, you'll look to the future, not to the past. So anger will interfere with this and keep us from being able to carry that out. And then the last thing that he's going to say in this book is about anger, nobility, and magnanimity. And we'll talk more about this in books 2 and 3. So what is magnanimity? Another more literal translation, great souledness. Megalopsychia in Latin, magnanimitas in Greek, and then magnanimitas in Latin, which is just a transliteration of that from Greek into Latin. And it means being able to rise above, being able to take a vantage point that puts things into perspective. And a lot of people think that anger contributes to magnanimity. And Seneca says it doesn't. Anger is more likely to make us vainglorious, prideful. The angry people believe themselves to be sort of exceptions. They're inspired with high and great ideas, but he says, unfortunately, there's no solid ground beneath, and what is built without a foundation is going to collapse into ruin. And he says, anger is as far removed from true magnanimity, greatness of soul, as foolhardiness is from courage, or boastfulness is from confidence, or gloom from austerity, cruelty from strictness. These are all fake virtues, right? These are all facsimiles, not the real thing. We want to be confident, but we don't want to be boastful. And foolish people mix those up. We want to be courageous. We don't want to be foolhardy, subjecting ourselves and others to dangers that we don't need to do. One is a vice, one is a virtue. So Seneca is going to go so far as to say there's actually nothing great or noble in anger, even when it seems to be powerful. It makes us feel powerful and to look down upon gods and men alike. And so he says that anybody who thinks that anger would produce greatness of mind has equal reason to think that, indulging yourself in luxuries or greed or lust or ambition produce it. And, he's got some pretty interesting arguments here. We don't necessarily need to accept every single one of them, but we're getting a very strong and starkly articulated view on the emotion of anger. So let me turn to the questions and comments. Ken says anger would also severely cloud judgment. Yeah. So in that respect, it would make a very unreliable weapon. Yeah. I mean, when we get angry, so it's interesting. I'm interested in anger in part because I've dealt with my own anger over the course of my lifetime, and I've read anger workbooks and things like that. And one of the really great lines that one of them started out with is, as soon as you get angry, remind yourself that you're now stupid. And you might say, no, I'm not. I'm still smart. Yes, but the anger makes you stupid. It makes you prone to making bad judgments. And judgment's like a stupid person, right? So there's something to that. Campbell says we might also reflect on the way we instinctively recoil from anger. Why is this? Because when other people feel anger and show it, it's scary. That's where Seneca began, right? Anger is one of the worst of the vices. You can see it in how a person is all bound up on themselves. Why are we afraid of other people's anger? Because our experience has been other people get angry and then they lash out, and maybe we would be the ones who get lashed out against, right? So that's, that's an important point. Let's see. Oralit says, it seems Seneca saw anger and reason as oppositional to each other. Did he ever consider they could be allies? Yeah, he considered it and said, no, that's what these arguments are about. He's definitely considered the possibilities and then said, that ain't going to work. The Aristotelians, the Platonists, they think that'll work, but it's sort of like a tool that's going to go against you. Now, you don't have to necessarily accept that, right? You could say, well, I think he's right about some of this stuff, but not all of this. But that is the Stoics' point of view. And it's, by the way, Cicero's point of view, as we talked about last session as well. Neo says, how we feel is justified, how we respond may not. So no virtue ethicist would actually say that. That's an interesting point. That's a modern psychology thing, where people are like, your feelings, not right or wrong. They just are what they are. It's what you do with them that counts. And the Aristotelians, the Platonists, the Epicureans, the Stoics, all the early Jewish and Christian thinkers, all the way into the Middle Ages, going into modernity, they would all say that's BS. Some emotions are actually wrong. Even Aristotle, who says, hey, you can have the right amount of certain emotions. Envy's wrong. Envy's never good, according to Aristotle. So that's a very late modern sort of self-helpy psychology point of view, but it's not one that's shared by most moralists throughout time. We can actually look at emotions and say, you're off base in feeling that emotion, because emotions have cognitive aspects to them. They are not just feelings or affects. They are judgments. They involve assessments of whether things are good or bad, right or wrong, deserved or undeserved, and whether it's appropriate to respond in certain ways. So that's something not just the Stoics think, but all the ancient virtue ethicists would think. Orlando, Stoicism, like anything in extremes, isn't ideal. At some point, the world needs to know I've had it. I mean, you probably don't know Stoicism that well if you're saying that. You would want to say that after you've actually gone through Stoic texts and tried living it out. There's no such thing as Stoicism out there that's on a scale that you can have the right amount of or anything along those lines. Campbell says magnanimity makes kings. I mean, it makes good people in general. You don't have to be a king, and most kings are not magnanimous. Most kings throughout history have not been good people. So I don't know that it has anything to do with that. Oralit, I guess when it comes to anger versus reason, I wonder how the Stoics thought we can reason that something is unjust without the embodied experience of feeling something is unjust. They think you can. I mean, it's that basic, right? Your reason doesn't have, your reason is embodied because the Stoics are materialists anyway, right? So you don't have to have that gut sense, that emotion driving you. You can use your facility of reason. You might not be able to do that right now as the person you are because you've had a whole lifetime of relying on gut feelings. But that's sort of like saying, well, a person can't possibly, do the military press because you've never actually tried it yourself or you didn't stick to it, right? So judging that a person can't do something unless they've got this thing going on the basis of not enough experience of it is a good way to get yourself mixed up about that. Augustus says the ancient thinkers weren't afraid to judge. Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't be afraid to judge. What you should be afraid of is judging wrongly, right? We should be judgy and judgmental. We should be making judgments all the time, including about ourselves. But we want those judgments to actually reflect reality. Not judging is not a good thing. That's actually setting you up for getting exploited and becoming a bad person in certain ways and going along with other people's bad behavior, you know. Alterability, wrong is in maladaptive. They're right according to the judgments, so maybe the judgments are maladaptive. Not sure what you're referencing, but yeah, judgments can be maladaptive, although not a that's sort of a jargony term. It's better to say they're wrong. You know, they're actually not based in the reality of things. If I get mad at my wife because I think that she is putting me down by washing my clothes and suggesting that I'm not smart enough to wash my own clothes, well, I'm making a whole bunch of stupid judgments they're not, it's not, I don't have to worry about whether they're maladaptive. That's a whole other thing. They're actually wrong, and they're going to lead me into stupid responses, you know? Alex says, if we're animals and we evolved to have an emotion of anger, indignation, it must serve some function both socially and personally. No, that's a mistaken inference. It could have been something that we had a use for way back in the day. We also evolve all sorts of crazy crap that we don't have use for. I mean, a lot of our DNA is junk, isn't it? So these sort of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology arguments, pretty weak, you know. A lot of assumptions that get built into that. And by the way, you notice that Seneca doesn't think that animals actually have anger. Human beings, as rational creatures, are able to have different emotions, fuller emotions, than animals are, according to Seneca. Campbell says, maybe I should have said magnanimity makes true kings. I mean, if true king means like being a good person, sure, it would be a component. I mean, you need a whole bunch of other things as well. So I don't know that it makes them in the sense of like being the one thing necessary. Alterability, wrong. Okay, that makes sense then. So ignorance can be part of why we get things wrong. It can also be, getting angry and then being stupid because of our anger. It could be there's no one source for why we go wrong. I know that people always want that sort of thing. Are people going wrong because they choose to, or because it's all ignorance? It's both and neither and more, you know. Human beings are super complicated, and the ways in which we screw ourselves up are complicated as well. It's not all due to one single cause. But, you know, our emotions can often be off base. And even if you're somebody who thinks you can have the right amount of emotional response and it can be directed in the right ways, like Aristotle, he thinks you have to be careful and you have to be mindful and rational about these sorts of things. So it's not just you just trust your emotions and they'll get you somewhere. You have to train them. You have to educate your emotions, so to speak. And that's where the Aristotelians and the Stoics are going to differ on anger. The Stoics think there's just really nothing you can do positive with anger. The Aristotelians think, yeah, there are things that you can do. And this is one of those cases where you kind of have to go this way or this way, and you can't have both, you know. It's possible both of them are wrong as well, but a lot of times in philosophy, you can't have it all. You can't be both a Platonist and Aristotelian and a Stoic and an Epicurean and, you know, all these other things. So, all right, I've got time for a few more questions or comments. I'm past my notes at this point. But any other ideas that you want to entertain? Remember, next month we'll be doing another one of these on Seneca's on Anger Book 2, and then we'll follow up with Book 3. So Alterability says, and here he's quoting Epictetus, Waterfield's translation, if virtue is knowledge, it follows that behaving non-virtuously is a product of ignorance. Yeah, I mean, some people think that. That doesn't make it true. And, you know, there are some passages in Epictetus where if you read through his works, and don't read Robin Waterfield, get yourself the actual, you know, discourses and stuff like that. And you're going to find that Epictetus also thinks that habit plays a part of this, right? And you can actually, reason with an angry person and get them to see that they've been misled. It's not just ignorance. So the Stoic view is actually more complicated than that. Alex says if other animals don't possess anger, maybe it's a higher function of moral beings like reason or laughter. It is a symptom of understanding the world is not just or from the way we currently view it. Sure, that's plausible. It would still be lower than reason, right? And it still would, for Seneca, he can say, you still don't want to rely on it. And anger is, anger does take a stance on the way the world and things within the world are. It is saying this was wrong, and because it was wrong, I should do this retaliatory thing in response. Like, somebody bullied my kid, I ought to go and talk to their dad, and if their dad doesn't want to punish the kid, then I should punch the dad in the face and say, how do you like it, jackass? Those are definite judgments about things, right? Seneca is saying you're probably going to do better with reason than you are relying on this distinctively human approach to anger. A dog, if it sees somebody being mean to another dog, it might go over and intervene, right? But it's not going to give an ultimatum and say, if you don't do something about this, I'm going to bite you. It just doesn't have those things quite as worked out as that. So, here's a bit of a side note too. Maybe the Stoics are wrong. Like a lot of ancient thinkers have this point of view. There's human beings and we're rational. And then there's other animals and there's like a dividing line between us. They are not rational at all. We are rational. It might be that other animals really do have some degree of rationality, like, elephants and apes and octopi and corvids and cetaceans, pigs, maybe, that's a whole other topic. Orlet says, I get stuck on how we can purely reason about right or wrong. Get rid of pure. And there goes, your problem goes away right there. Without experiencing anger when punched in the face, you need lots of axioms to arrive at the conclusion that being punched is bad. If you need a lot of axioms to figure out that getting punched in the face is bad, you are badly off. That's not hard to figure out, right? You don't have to be a rocket scientist doing, or a mathematician doing proofs to figure that out. Right? That's that one's pretty straightforward. And you don't even need axioms. Campbell points out the axiom is pain. If you're thinking about it in terms of axioms, you're already screwed up. You're not really, you're doing some weird thing that I don't know whose philosophy that's coming from. It doesn't take that much to do this. And Seneca thinks, this is back in ancient times, you can use reason. And, if you read around in his works and you read other Stoic works, you'll get a strong sense of what that reason looks like and what good reasoning processes look like and how we can steer them from mistaken lines of reasoning to better lines of reasoning. It doesn't have to be that complicated or that abstract in order for you to do it. And you could get angry, get punched in the face and get angry, put your anger aside, figure out what the right thing to do is. Alterability, but getting punched isn't bad according to the Stoics. It's not preferred for most people, so they try to avoid it. And that's a wrong point of view. Getting punched in the face is unjust. Justice is a virtue. A lot of people go way too far with a couple Stoic doctrines, and they think that that's all that Stoicism is. You can find stuff where, Epictetus will say, well, it's not the person insulting you that hurts you. It's your judgment that it's the insult. And then you'll find Epictetus saying, and you shouldn't behave this way, and other people shouldn't behave this way, and you should protect people from that. So Stoicism is a complex constellation of ideas. You don't want to try to make broad sweeping statements about the entire system based on just little nuggets. Campbell says, third time's the charm, judges for me. Magnanimity and the spirit of high-minded judgment makes true kings. Who cares? what makes true kings. Are we worried about monarchy right now? I mean, sure, it's a component in what a true king would be, meaning a good king. How is that helpful for us unless we're living under a monarchy? Alterability, good and bad, is found in our reasons. Everything else is according to its nature. I don't know where you're getting that from, but that's, again, one of those sort of sweeping statements that if you rely on that, you're probably not going to get that far with Stoicism, right? You got to put quotes like that in context with other quotes that are talking about similar things, good and bad. But I mean, if you're getting it out of the discourses, Epictetus sure as hell doesn't say that. It's not in our reasons. It's in our proairesis, which is our choices and our commitments and the part of ourselves that does that, which, by the way, is also the rational part and the ruling part. See how complicated it gets very quickly? Again, you don't want to try to make single quips from a Stoic source have to do, no, choices based on reasons, correct? You're importing somebody else's ideas. Read the Epictetus. Try to put together the complex picture rather than trying to fire off, little clarifications here, because you've already kind of gone astray. You want to spend the time with the Epictetus if that's really what you're interested in. And you're going to find a very complex psychology articulated there in the discourses. So any other questions, comments about on anger, Seneca, the Stoics, those sorts of things? I'll remind everybody, we're going to do book 2, book 3 of this in the coming months. You're going to get a lot more practices, a lot more insights. Book 1 is kind of a warm-up and clearing the ground. Book 2 and book 3 are where the real meat is going to be for this. So I'm not seeing any other questions or comments. So we'll end here for this time. Thanks for all of your engagement, questions, comments, and we'll pick this up. And then beyond Seneca, we'll also look at Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, some of the other things that the Stoics have had to say. And then after that, we're going to move into Middle Platonism with the great thinker Plutarch, who will be a lot of fun, and some other later ancient authors. So I will see you. Have a great rest of the day wherever you are, and we'll pick it up next time.